Discussing Nick Lane's The Vital Question. This is a book discussion. I just finished Nick Lane's The Vital Question. Nick Lane is a biochemist and he tackles questions of profound interest to me, which is the origins of life, the mechanics of biology, the reason we are the way we are as a species, as a living being. In other words, uh, why did we evolve the way we evolved? And I think his big contribution is that he's trying to argue from first principles. That's the big contribution. And Nick Lane was recommended to me by Andrei Karpathy. Not personally, I'm not friends with him or anything, but I've heard him recommend this book several times, and he also recommended Lex Friedman to invite Nick Lane. So Nick Lane was on Lex Friedman. So that's kind of the connection here. And I think his big contribution is the first principle approach, and I think that's probably where the connection with Karpathy comes. Karpathy has worked under Musk for a long time, and therefore I think has that same approach. Try to understand what are the fundamental driving blocks of something, and then argue from that. That's kind of what first principle means. And what Nick Lane does, which I find is so creative, is he just looks at the single most important driver for evolution, which is the way organisms harness energy. So that's his, I would say, his big contribution. And the funny thing about this is you could argue that this is kind of trivial. Well, you're telling me life is all about energy? Well, yeah, because without energy, there ain't no life. So on the one hand, it might be trivial, but on the other hand, asking the question that way, looking at the world that way, all of a sudden changes a lot of perspective. For example, it takes away this notion of, let's say, life is about information processing, because what exactly does that even mean? But if you boil it down to, well, yes, it's about information. For example, it's about how a genome, let's say a female genome, matches a male genome and optimizes for what? Well, for the mitochondrial DNA, or the DNA that expresses mitochondria, which is the actual machine that harnesses energy, which transfers energy from food into the organism. So I think that's the great innovation here, that it's not saying life is about energy. People say that all the time. Energy is important, but it's the way to phrase the question, what is life? And start from first principle. Well, life starts with energy. So how is energy being harnessed? Where do we see the beginnings of life? And all these questions are incredibly interesting. And I think Lane's big contribution is first that this line is very blurred, that the definition of life is sort of in a Popperian way not possible. That means you have to read from right to left. Life is the thing that does X, Y, Z. It's not the other way around, but the definition of life is blah, 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 blah. I think that's great. And again, it's about harnessing energy, which is fundamental to everything. And I've used this in my essay about, fusion is illusion, abundant energy is not. I've actually used this book. I've quoted this book because I've argued that life is about how energy is harvested. So harvesting energy is evolution, and that applies to economics as well. So economic organizations, economic entities, countries, companies, whatever, are defined by the way they harness energy. In the end, those are the real companies. Those are the real economies. All the other stuff, the Switzerlands and Singapores of this world, the paper pushers, finance, that kind of stuff, it's fine. But in the end, it's about energy. Even Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley fundamentally is about energy. If you look at what Google or OpenAI or Tesla or these big Silicon Valley companies are doing, NVIDIA, they're in the end, they're all about energy, because energy is the main constraint. Now they call it power, they call it heat, but it's all about energy. How do you harness actual energy? So that's going to be the discussion in this episode. I'm also going to try to isolate what I think is the takeaway when it comes to my business. I often talk about the importance of reading books. It's conditioning of the mind, but I want to be more specific. What are the attack vectors here? What's the defense? What can I learn from this book? This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's January 11, 2023. This is Krendelko. For the day, the fund is up 2.7%. The market's up 70 basis points. For the year, we are up 20 basis points. The market is up 3%. We're underperforming by 2.8%. The market is still open. These things are subject to change. Just before I go into the book discussion, there's a lot of conversation about Tesla and the pricing. I think we're very happy with them reducing prices in China. We expect them to reduce prices also in actually all around the world, because we've said several times that for us, the real case about Tesla is really to increase customer value. And customer value is increased by increasing the quotient of customer value delivered divided by the total cost of ownership. So if you can tweak both sides of this equation, of this quotient, then you can increase customer value, which is fundamentally what's going to drive the success of Tesla and also drive wealth. Now let's get back to the book. The vital question, Nick Lane. Nick Lane is a biochemist. He is interesting because he looks at biochemistry from first principles. Now, the critique on the book is such, I would say that it is quite technical. So sometimes, he lost me a few times in terms of too much jargon, too much detail, too much diagrams and graphs and things like that. But that's okay. I think I can't blame him. He's still a scientist. This is a popular science book with a lot of science in there, and you can't escape that. So, but just for readers that are maybe have allergies to scientific jargon, there is quite a bit of scientific jargon here, and you just don't have to live with that. But anyway, the insights are great. There's some really nice anecdotes. For example, Nick Lane makes this argument that evolution is optimizing for what's really useful in an organism. And then he uses an example of Henry Ford, who went to the junkyard and looked at old Model Ts and saw that certain parts of the Model T were still intact while others weren't, and the Model T was thrown away. And then he ordered his factories to reduce the quality of those parts that were still intact. In other words, why do I need a good, let's say, left part of the chassis if the car as a whole is useless? So let's make it a little bit cheaper so it breaks down together with all the other things. And this kind of brings in a whole new approach towards manufacturing. If you think about it, manufacturing is not about maximizing quality. It's really about optimizing, making sure that the whole car is produced in such a way that the quality of the car is defined by the lowest common denominator, or that thing that the car can't live without, and everything else should be optimized to that level of quality. So if, let's say, the battery in the Tesla is the limiting factor and the battery lasts 8 years, well, then technically the whole car shouldn't last more than 8 years. Or you can replace the battery for $20,000, but then the other things should last more, so that it's worth replacing the battery. So this is a very interesting approach towards manufacturing, for example. There's another tidbit in the book that is, he says it's about competition, and it's about fierce competition and the necessity for evolution to come up with new ideas. And he's using an anecdote from, I think it's Orson Welles, the filmmaker, who said that under the Borgias, Italy had bloodshed and war and intrigue and corruption, but it also produced Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and the Renaissance. And Switzerland had 500 years of brotherly love, and all they produced is the Cuckoo's clock, which is not even true. A Cuckoo's clock actually produced and sold in Germany, but nevertheless, you get the point. So those are interesting ways to think about evolution and life. I think if I summarize the book, it's really about two things. Number one, it's energy is the constraining factor. So if you understand how energy is harvested in an organism, you can then go boil down to first principles and try to understand what does it mean to harness energy. And then that thing that harnesses energy is life. And that thing that harnesses energy can then evolve through information, through DNA, and all these other things that we know. But it's all about how to actually harness energy. And the fundamental building blocks here are the mitochondria, which is sort of a cell within a cell. So it's literally, and I think this is a provable hypothesis, that there used to be the prokaryotes, which is the one-cell organisms, and then somehow another cell got into them and that's where the eukaryotes came out of, which is kind of think of it an organism with a nucleus. So there was something that came from the outside and entered that cell and then started to specialize. But even more importantly, it's all about the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is the machine that harvests energy from food. So think about it. And we have that in human cells, and pretty much everything else that has anything else in the eukaryote world is the thing that has this mitochondria or some mitochondria type machinery that takes energy out of a resource and uses it for its own thing. For example, photosynthesis is another way to basically consume food or consume energy. So what's so important about this? It's that if you look at the mitochondria and then you go further and you say, okay, we have, let's say in eukaryotes, we have this thing called sex, which is when a male and a female organism combine and create a new organism. And the question is, why do we have sex? Well, we have sex because we want to increase the likelihood of some sort of mutation that then adapts to the environment. I mean, this is sort of the Darwinian explanation of why we have sex, right? And if we then go further and we ask ourselves, well, is that a good thing evolutionarily? The answer is, yeah, it's a good thing because it increases variety. But here's the big but. There's a constraint, and the constraint is that maybe if we combine two genomes from two different organisms, in other words, we have sex, we might also have a sort of a low fertility rate. In other words, we might create offsprings that are not optimal. And what exactly does that mean? It means that we could have a combination of DNA between male and female DNA that creates a suboptimal mitochondria, and therefore suboptimal energy harvesting, and therefore the offspring dies. So this is the constraint, and I find this so amazing that we can look at life from that perspective. Okay, we want to increase variety, but we also want to decrease the risk of having bad mitochondria. This is what I read from this book. This is the one important message that I got from this book. And then there's a couple of examples. The beautiful examples with the bird. Why is a male bird so full of colors? Well, because colors signal the shade of colors, the shade of, the way colors are coordinated. They signal mitochondrial DNA, and the female gets attracted by certain types of colors. And if you take that further and you ask yourself, even us humans, okay, I mean, there's a lot of research about how we mate, and I personally believe that we mate in a very sort of binary way, that we go through life. I'm a male person, looks for girls, and vice versa, and that we have all those girlfriends and all that stuff, and that's fine. Teenage years, you try, even in your low 20s probably, and then at some point that thing happens, this thing, oh my gosh, I fell in love. And here's the thing, I think it's exactly when we see that match, when we see that's her, she is the one, because she's got that match. So what Nick Lane would say is what we're really trying to match is mitochondrial DNA. And that's what we're trying to match from a male perspective, but then, from a biochemistry or sort of origin of life perspective, actually it's the other way around. It's the female that chooses the male, and she chooses the best possible combination of mitochondrial DNA with her DNA. Okay, that's important. And that's why it's so amazing, because there's another great sentence in Nick Lane's book, which is anything that can happen will happen. And that's because DNA is very versatile. So you have all these types of combinations. If you look around the world, if you look around life in general, you go to, a city like, let's say, New York City is a good example, where you have, all these different types of people, all these varieties of people. Well, where do they come from? They come from this amazing concept that variety is all over, is everywhere, and that we combine ourselves in very different ways and create different types of people, and that's what proliferates our species. So I think, again, this is the first big takeaway. The second takeaway, I think a typical evolutionary biologist takeaway, is that, look, everything is about competition, it's about adaptation, it's about finding the best possible match towards the constraints that environment is throwing at you. And that's a very interesting, I think that's a very interesting way to look at life. And it's maybe not the kind of way that we humans like to look at ourselves, because we have this tendency to sometimes try to try to manage the outcomes. This is also a very political conversation that is always circling around, free markets versus intervention versus regulation. It's all in that same realm. So if we go back to evolutionary biology and we look at how actually life evolves, it's about competition, and competition happens through trying to differently variate genes so that mitochondrial DNA gets combined in different ways, and therefore energy can be harvested in different ways. There's a couple of other really interesting concepts. For example, the concept of an archeological intermediary, which I find very, very interesting, particularly when you're in the business of disruption. You think about that a lot. We've spoken about this in the past when we, one of our episodes I put in the show notes, where we spoke about the person from New York, Chicago, that does research and tries to answer the question, which species actually had the idea to go from water to land. And there was an intermediary. There was something in intermediary that was able to live a little bit in the water, a little bit on land. So we have some of the offsprings of that, like say frogs and all that. But in general, the idea is that we have archaeological intermediaries. Also, Nick Lane in his book, he ends the book with a chapter which is sort of information from the far deep or something along those lines, where Japanese biochemists found a thing which is kind of like a prokaryote, so a one-cell organism, bacteria, but also has eukaryotic characteristics, so some sort of combination. And a very interesting thing that Nick Lane says is that these types of archaeological intermediaries, they really are kind of like the foot soldiers, the front line in the war, meaning they typically don't survive. That's why it's so hard to find them. But they are the intermediary on which others build on. This is also, there's this concept of, in a completely different context, other than maybe energy, which is the same context, there's this concept of the pioneer species in energy, which is very similar, which says that, let's say, Bitcoin mining is a pioneer species, which I found, there's an article that I discussed a couple of weeks ago. It says that when you go to, let's say, very uninhabitable parts of the world, let's say deserts and things like that, what you often find is this concept of the pioneer species. It's the first one that can survive. The first one that can survive, let's say in a desert, it's some sort of fungus, or like Bitcoin mining could be the first one that can survive in the western part of Texas. But then you can start building ecosystems around that and big economies. And then maybe that archaeological intermediary or that pioneer species actually doesn't even survive, dies. You don't even know that they were there, but they were the ones that built they built the ground, the fundamental humus that was necessary to then build larger ecosystems around this. So there's a lot of things come together, and I find the most amazing things about reading books like this, and like I say many times, it's really it's mental yoga. It's like trying to get inspiration. What does inspiration mean? Trying to think about stuff from different perspective, but also see the combination, see the lines that sort of go through and connect things, or connect the dots, if you will. That's the beauty. And I think this book, The Vital Question, is one of those, and I can see why Karpati likes him so much, likes Nick Lane so much, because he's just a very inspiring person. I mean, that's really all there is. He's an inspiring person. He's one of those creative minds that can transcend ideas, that can think about, let's say, a very fundamental question: what is biology, what is life, and look at it from a perspective that maybe you wouldn't have thought before. And this is what makes it so powerful. So to summarize, discussing Nick Lane's The Vital Question, two big takeaways. Number one, life is about how we harness energy, and Nick Lane boils it down to the mitochondrial DNA and the way people, let's say in sex, eukaryotes, when they combine, that's what they're really trying to optimize for is mitochondrial DNA, because the mitochondria is the thing that harnesses energy from food. Second, the evolution is all about adaptation, and adaptation is about variety, and the constraint about being as various as possible is actually the mitochondrial DNA. So how do we harness energy? So life is an optimization function, is as much variety as possible with as good of an energy harvesting technology as possible. And maybe lastly, also I want to mention the archeological intermediary. Very, very important. Let's say also for business, we have often, let's say a plug-in hybrid is an archeological intermediary that will die out because we will have in the end fully battery electric cars. Thank you.